Hello guys, what's up? Um okay, so let me put on the banners at the bottom. I'm on partial shadow ban. It's hard to find my videos. You can never find the first three. If you want to find my videos, go to vincentbrunoshadowban.blogspot.com. It's at the bottom of the screen and in the description box, and there you can find my videos. The title of this video is Judeo. Oh, I gotta change that. Hold on. Is Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry. Um, yeah, is Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry, though you won't hear much about Freemasonry or Judaism today. If you want to learn about Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry, go to bewisestserpents.blogspot.com. Um, which is at the bottom of the screen and in the description box, and you will find all of that. I am looking for ex-Christian scientists who would be interested in exposing Christian Science as like a really messed up cult where children die and people believe insane things. Its connection to Freemasonry, helping people escape Christian Science. I'm also interested in its connections to Hinduism. I'm an ex-Hindu, and Christian Science is close to Vedanta. So if you can kind of escape Christian Science, you can escape Hinduism. Okay, so I am reading Mrs. Eddy by Edwin Dankin, and it's a very unflattering biography of Mrs. Mary Baker Eddy, who founded Christian Science, and very unflattering. And then we're listening to Mary Baker Eddy's book, Science and Health with Keys to the Scriptures. So last where we left off, okay, so Mary Baker Eddy is trying to get rid of this highly influential woman named Augusta Stetson. And Mary Baker Eddy is about to die, and she's scared of her legacy being handed over to this woman named Augusta Stetson rather than the committee of her mother church. So she's finding a way to get rid of Mrs. Stetson. So what happened was Mrs. Stetson is so loved that her students send her gold and a letter. And Mrs. Stetson is so devoted to Mrs. Eddy, she feels like Mrs. Eddy deserves the gold and the letter, so she sends it all to Mrs. Eddy. Now, in one of those letters, one of her students calls her the Christ. So this is a really weak argument to excommunicate somebody, but I guess, she's like, oh, Mrs. Stetson thinks that she's the Christ, and that's illegal under Christian Science. So I'm going to throw her out. So that's where we're at. So let's continue. Hold on. Mrs. Eddy did not think it necessary to state what just steps she herself had already taken to bring about a separation with speed and permanence. Instead, she hastened on her motherly duty of issuing due warning. You have been duly informed by me that, however much I desire to read all that you sent to me, I have no time to do so. It is here that Mrs. Eddy established her subsequent alibi for the whole delicate operation. Whatever her board did with the letters, Augusta could understand that Mrs. Eddy personally was not concerned in the unfortunate business. Pilate had washed his hands, but even yet Mrs. Eddy was not quite finished. The Christian Science Publishing Society will settle the question whether or not they shall publish your poems. It is part of their duties to relieve me of so much labor. I thank you for the money which you sent me, which was given you by your students. I shall devote it to a worthy charitable purpose. Mr. Adam Dickney is my secretary, though whom all my business is transacted. It was a unique document, one of the most interesting in the whole range of Eddy literature. The wheel of Mrs. Eddy's legal procedure thereafter began immediately to grind. The letters, after going to the board of directors, were published in the Sentinel with a denunciation editorial. The board made its plans, and yet one must conclude that as Mrs. Eddy lay awake in her bed at night, her courage momentarily failed her. She feared Augusta more than anyone else in the world. Something malicious animal magnetism that might emanate from an enraged Augusta more than anything else in her universe. Perhaps after all, it might be better to temporize her so she wrote another letter 11 days after the first one. Sorry, the page is cut off. Dear student, awake and rise from this temptation produced by animal magnetism upon yourself, allowing your students to something you and me. Treat yourself for it and get your students to help something rise out of it. I will be your destruction if you do not. It will be your destruction if you do not do this. Answer this letter immediately. Mrs. Stetson, in reply, wrote a long, puzzled letter that something blindly for the reason behind these shattered thunderbolts. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Eddy never once resented something of herself. She only depreciated it. By the laws forbidding it were inserted at a late date merely in answer to general public ridicule. The real trouble was now that Augusta's students were deifying not Mrs. Eddy, but you and me. Her students now wrote rather pitiful dismay. I have always delighted to revere, follow, and obey you. I am something by the divine rules laid down in your writings. Precious leader, I am watching and praying that the enemy of good cannot separate me from you, my leader and teacher. Beloved leader, something are ever speaking of my heart, your loving child, Augusta. Despite its reassuring tone, this letter seems to have prompted Mrs. Eddy to an immediate action, for she apparently did not write again to her board until about a week later. Meanwhile, wheels had begun to turn. The board of directors, highest tribunal of Christian Science, called Mrs. Stetson to Boston before the end of July to catechize her concerning her doctrinal heresies and dismiss her from the church. But while Mrs. Stetson was in Boston, Mrs. Eddy must have had another change of heart. She evidently decided that it would be safer not to try to proceed with the business after all, for the board dismissed all the charges, hearing only one witness. Mrs. Stetson was allowed to return to New York. The directors wrote the trustees of Mrs. Stetson's church that it had been decided to allow them to apply their discipline to their erring members. One may fairly conjecture Mrs. Eddy's condition in this crisis: a body racked by hysterical pain, which the torture of uncertainty had always induced, a mind distraught by the indecision of fear. She had no doubt of the consequences of allowing Augusta Stetson to remain in the church. If, on the other hand, she excommunicated Augusta, she would have to face the terror of malicious animal magnetism, so potent when it was directed by an adept manipulator. But Mrs. Eddy's board was not as fearful of malicious animal magnetism as she was, and by this time they were thoroughly aroused. They had to take their orders from Mrs. Eddy, but they had no intention whatever of allowing Mrs. Stetson to stay in the church. Furthermore, they had small hope that Mrs. Stetson's own board of trustees would take any disciplinary action. Her trustees were all her own students. They were as much to Mrs. Stetson's creatures as Mrs. Eddy's board was the echo of Mrs. Eddy. Thus, Mrs. Eddy's board called on all of Mrs. Stetson's practitioners to come to Boston and be catechized. The Boston officials discovered many heresies in the testimony taken during a period of session that lasted over 2 weeks. They learned that Mrs. Stetson was openly teaching that the Mary Baker Eddy was divine. Worse still, she had taught that she, Augusta Stetson, was the second in divinity only to Mrs. Eddy. She had said openly that only she could lead her students to Mrs. Eddy and go to God. Yet even this did not shock the board so much as further revelations that they themselves, Mrs. Eddy's chosen directors, were being treated by Mrs. Stetson and her practitioners. Their names were being taken up at the new meetings with the suggestion that they had lost all power. On one occasion, Mrs. Stetson had gone so far as to tell them in this absent treatment to go 6 feet underground. This could mean that only one thing. She was seeking to bring upon them death. She was actually daring to attempt destruction of the chief officials of Christian Science Church. Mrs. Stetson later explained that she meant only to tell the Adam in the directors, that is, their evil and mortal nature, to retire to the nether world. This was quite enough to the board of directors. They brought the hearing to a close and then called to Boston the trustees of Mrs. Stetson's church. In a conference in the boardroom of the mother church held September 24th, the Boston board held the New York board that actions against Mrs. Stetson must be taken immediately. Mrs. Stetson's loyal board was quite incredulous. Mrs. Eddy's directors therefore decided that it was time to crack the whip, and Mrs. Eddy, in a moment of daring to brave all the forces of malicious animal magnetism, consented. Thereupon her board sent to Mrs. Stetson a letter admonishing for her errors, finding that she was not fit for the work of a teacher and revoking her right both to teach and practice as a church healer. Her card was withdrawn from the Christian Science Journal, automatically revoking all recognition of her as practitioner. Thus, without excommunicating her, a way had been found to humble her. She could still go to a church and sit in the front pew in that magnificent temple where she had ruled so long, but no longer could she have any official standing whatsoever as a teacher and exponent of the faith. When news of this action was brought to Augustus Stetson, signed with the dignity and authority of the board of directors of the mother church, she gave no sign of the tragedy which was welling in her heart. She paused, waited for a voice, the voice of the woman Augusta had loved and served as precious teacher. One single word from her would turn this blow. No word came. There was no sound from the woman cloistered at Chestnut Hill, dry-eyed, serene. Mrs. Stetson calmly called her trustee together. She laid the charges against herself before the members. She then retired from their deliberations. She was still waiting for a sign. Her life's work and love were suddenly crumbling around her. The sign came. It was Mrs. Eddy's voice speaking through the Sentinel of October 16th. Take notice. I approve the bylaws of the Mother Church and require the Christian Science Board of Directors to maintain them and sustain them. These directors do not act contrary to the rules of church manual, neither do they trouble me with their difficulties with individuals in their own church or with the members of branch churches. My province as a leader, as the discoverers and founders of Christian Science, is not to interfere in cases of discipline, and I hereby publicly declare that I am not personally involved in the affairs of the church in any way than through my writings and published rules, all of which are to be read by the individuals who desire to inform themselves of the fact. Again, for all time, Mrs. Eddy was disclaiming responsibility for whatever fate befell Augustus Stetson. She had disassociated herself from the whole nasty business. As for Augustus Stetson, it was her faith that finally ruined her. Her belief in Mary Baker Eddy was her ultimate undoing. Without making it move to her own defense, she allowed her honors to be plucked up from her. Her robes of the high priestess to be torn away, her life's work to be shattered, and she only bowed her head. At almost any moment before the end, she could have gathered around her the remnants of her stately robes, taken sword in hand, and vanquished every enemy. She could have appeared before her altar in the midst of ecstatic worshippers, and with 1 hour exhortation and a final word of command, torn the Christian Science Church in half. Most of her followers would undoubtedly have deserted all other standards to follow her. They would have been seceded eagerly had she made one single move to persuade them to journey out with her to new and more delightful promised lands. There were a few indeed in her church who could resist her dynamic power and eloquence. There were few who her dynamic power and eloquence when she chose to exert it. Mrs. Eddy, now only a myth to almost everyone in her organization, could not have availed against the extraordinary personal appeal of Mrs. Stetson, and Mrs. Stetson sought to raise her voice. Mrs. Stetson sought to raise her voice, but she made no move. Even more than she loved power and wealth and influence, she worshipped her conception of the woman she knew as Mrs. Eddy, Mary Baker Eddy, whom she had thought dead and now knew lived. Mrs. Eddy, had she only known it, had nothing to fear from Augustus Stetson. For Mrs. Stetson, her slightest which was a command. Thus does faith work in its miracles, and thus did it render service to Mrs. Eddy even in her old age. Augustus Stetson went to her grave proclaiming that Mrs. Eddy was divine and could not err. She maintained that Mrs. Eddy stood by while she was crucified by the board of directors for just one reason. Miss Eddy, in the role of Christ, was showing Augustus Stetson how to rise to an even higher state of consciousness, where one could build on a holy and spiritual foundation and live entirely apart from the lower levels of either a material organization or a material world. Humbly worshipfully, Mrs. Stetson wrote to Mrs. Eddy when she received news that she could no longer teach or heal in the Christian Science Church. My precious leader, teacher, and guide, I have learned your dear voice in your letter, which appeared in the Sentinel of October 16th. I am today sending in my resignation as a member of the Board of Trustees of First Church of Christ Scientist, New York. I am also notifying the secretary of my student association that I shall not attend to the approaching annual meeting, and I shall strictly not oppose the orders of the Board of Directors of the First Church of Christ Scientist in Boston, Massachusetts. I am apprehending more and more the meaning of holy spiritual building, which you enjoined upon me by the church in your letter in the Sentinel of January 16th. My gratitude and love for my precious leader are beyond all that human language can express. Your faithful child, Augusta. Okay. Let's listen to Science and Health.
Voluntary submission to it. If today the general thought embraced the science of being, man's longevity would increase tenfold and immortality be brought to light. The years of man will be extended as the belief of intelligent matter is destroyed, until at length that full recognition of truth shall destroy all sin, sickness, and death. Error will continue 7,000 years from the time of Adam, its origin. At the expiration of this period, truth will be generally comprehended, and science roll back the darkness that now hides the eternal sunshine and lift the curtain on paradise, where earth produces at the command of intelligence and soul instead of sense govern man. End of chapter. Chapter 5. Prayer and Atonement. Thoughts unuttered are not unknown to the infinite intelligence comprehending them, to whom a desire is prayer, and no loss can occur from trusting God with our desires to mold and make higher before they are evolved into action. But prayer has its motives, and what are they? To make him better that prays, or to benefit his hearers, to inform the infinite of what is ignorant, or to be heard of men. First, are we benefited by praying? Were God a person to be moved by the breath of praise, or lessen infinite understanding, or changing in love and wisdom, he might do more good because of our petitions and grant them on the ground of the petitioner, in which case lip service were an advantage not to be overlooked. But God is love, and do we ask him to be more than this to man? God is intelligence, and can we inform the infinite wisdom, or tell of your needs, the infinitesimal part already comprehended? Do we hope to change perfection in one of its arrangements, or shall we plead for more of the open font, pouring in all we receive, and more cannot be given? Does prayer
Join Happy Optimum customers and get 1 gig fiber internet for as low as $55 a month. Plus,
prayer bring us near the divine source of all being and blessedness? Then it is the prayer of works and not words, asking to love God, never made us love him. But this desire, expressed in daily watchfulness and assimilation to the divine character, molds and fashions us to his image. The danger of audible prayer is that we fall into temptation through it and become an involuntary hypocrite. First, by uttering what is not a real desire, and secondly, consoling ourselves under sin with the recollection we had prayed over it. Hypocrisy is fatal to Christianity, and praying publicly, we often go beyond our means, beyond the honest standpoint of fervent and habitual desire, if we are not yearning in secret and striving for the accomplishment of all we ask. Ours are vain repetitions, such as a heathen uses. If our petition is sincere, we shall labor for what we pray, and be rewarded by him who seeth in secret and rewardeth openly. No expression of them can make our desires more or less, nor gain the ear omnipotence sooner by words than thoughts. If every petition and prayer is sincere, God knows it before we tell him, and letting it remain honestly before him, we incur no risk of overtalking our real state. Prayer is sometimes employed, like a Catholic confession, to cancel sin, and this impedes Christianity. Sin is not forgiven. We cannot escape its penalty. Being sorry for its committal is but one step towards reform, and the very smallest one. The next step that wisdom requires is the test of our sincerity, namely a reformation. To this end, we are placed under stress of circumstance, where the temptation comes to repeat the offense, and the woe comes for what has been done until we learn there is no discount in the law of retribution, and we must pay the uttermost farthing. The measure we have meted out will be measured to us again, full and running over. Christian and sinners get their full measurement, but not here. A follower of Christ, for centuries to come, must drink his cup. Ingratitude and persecution will fill it to the brim. But God pours the riches of joy in the understanding and gives us strength as our clay. Sinners flourish as the green bay tree, but looking farther, David saw their end. Prayer cannot change the science of being, for goodness alone reaches the demonstration of truth. A petition for another to work for us never does the work required of us. To address deity as a person perpetuates the belief of God in man, which impedes spiritual progress and hides truth. We reach the science of Christianity only through demonstration, but here our good will be evil spoken of, and falsehood will war against advancing truth. Principle should govern man. Person can pardon but not reform the sinner. God is not a separate wisdom from the wisdom we possess, and the talent he hath given to be used we must improve. Therefore, to call on God to do our work for us is vainly supposing we have little to do but to ask for pardon and recommit the offense. If prayer cherishes the belief sin is forgiven, and man better because he prays, it is asking amiss, for he is worse if the punishment sin incurs is kept back, or he thinks himself forgiven when he is not. Prayer is impressive. It gives momentary solemnity and elevation to thought, but does a state of ecstasy produce lasting benefit? Looking deeply and metaphysically into these things, we find a reaction takes place, unfavorable understanding and sober resolve, and the wholesome perception of God's requirements, also that personal sense, and not soul, produces these moods of feeling. If spiritual sense guided man at such times, there would grow out of these ecstatic desires higher experiences and a better life, self-examination and more purity. A self-satisfied ventilation of ecclesiastical fervor never made a Christian. Verbal prayer embraces too much error to forward this great purpose. First, it supposes God a person influenced by man, making a divine ear a personal sense instead of the all-hearing and all-knowing intelligence to whom every want of man is understood, and by whom it will be supplied. Again, what we desire and ask to be given is not always best for us to receive, in which case the infinite understanding will certainly not grant our request. Therefore, what avails it with God bow how much a man prays? When we pray aright, we shall enter into the closet, in other words, shut the door of the lips, and in the silent sanctuary of earnest longing, deny sin and sense, and take up the cross, while we go forth with honest hearts, laboring to reach wisdom, love, and truth. This prayer will be answered in so much as we shall put in practice our desires. The Master's injunction was to pray in secret, to desire to be better, and let our lives attest the sincerity of that desire. Are we really grateful for the good we receive? Then we shall have more, and never until then, and avail ourselves of blessings we have. And this will thank God more than speech. From the intelligence that numbers the very hairs on our head, we cannot conceal the ingratitude of barren lives by thanking omnipotence with our lips, while the heart is far from truth. When we vainly imagine gratitude as a mere expression of thanks, we had better examine our hearts and learn what is there, and this will show us what we are, and is the only honest expression of ourselves. How empty are the conceptions of deity that admit theoretically the omnipotence and omnipresence of God, and then would inform the supreme mind or plead for pardon that is unmerited, or for blessings poured out liberally. If we are not grateful for life, truth, and love, but return thanks to them, we are insincere and incur the sharp censure bestowed upon the hypocrite. The only acceptable prayer in this case is to put our finger to our lips and remember our blessing. Praying for humility, with however much fervency of expression, is not always to desire it. If we turn away from the poor and set aside their judgment, we are not fit to receive the reward of that which blesses the poor. When confessing to a very wicked heart and asking to have it laid bare before us, Do we not know more of this heart than we are willing our neighbor should know? And if a friend informs us of a fault, do we listen to the rebuke patiently and credit what is said, or rather join in thanks that we are not as the other men? It is many years that I have been more grateful for a merited rebuke than for flattery. The only real sting is the unmerited censure, the wicked falsehood that does no one any good. Do we love our neighbors as ourselves? Or because we do not, should we pray to be given this love, and expect it because of asking, while we pursue the old selfishness, satisfied with having prayed for something better, without a single evidence of the sincerity of this request by living consistent with that prayer? If selfishness gives place in us to love, we shall love our neighbor and bless them that curse us, but can never meet this great demand by asking for it. There is a cross to be taken up before the reward is given. Do we love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and strength? This includes much, even the surrender of all personal affections and personal worship. It is the ultimate of being, the science of the life that recognizes only the consciousness, spirit, wherein soul is our master, and sense without a claim. Are you willing to leave all for Christ, truth, and be reckoned with sinners? Have you reached this point? No? Do you really desire to attain it? No? Then wherefore make long prayers about it and ask to become Christ-like, when these are the footsteps of our dear Master? If unwilling to drink his cup, wherefore pray with the lips to be partakers of it? The only consistent prayer is to do right so far as we understand the right, and to walk in the light so far as we receive it, even though it be with bleeding footsteps, and let our real desires and works be rewarded by the Father who seeth in secret. The whole world will not understand Christianity for centuries to come. When we are good enough to take his cup of earthly sorrows, we shall have it, until we are and do drink of it. All the vain repetitions that heathens use can never reach the demonstration that Jesus gave and instructed his followers to give as the test of Christianity, saying, "And these signs shall follow you." We learn in science the necessity for Christians to suffer in this wicked world of sense, inasmuch as they oppose it and are helping to destroy it. Therefore, it would destroy them. Anciently in Japan, they conveyed a praying machine through the streets, stopping at the doors to earn a penny grinding out a prayer. But in the belief of higher civilization, we pay for prayers in lofty edifices. Experience teaches that we receive not the good we ask for inaudible prayer. Petitioning a personal deity is a misapprehension of the source and means of all good and blessedness. Therefore, it cannot be beneficial, and we receive not, because, as the Scripture saith, we ask amiss to consume it on our lusts. Suffering for sin is all that destroys it. Every supposed pleasure of personal sense will furnish more than its balance in pain, until the belief of life and intelligence in matter is ultimately destroyed. We are not rid of mortal experiences, or sin, sickness, or death in the change called death. We cannot reach heaven, the harmony of life, except we understand the principle of harmonious being. That alone destroys personal sense and error. Seeking is not sufficient to destroy error. Striving to enter into the straight and narrow way of science is all that will enable us to do it. Spiritual attainment are the preparation for heaven, and that which opens a door to a higher understanding, even the life that is God. The petitions to a personal deity bring to man only the results of his belief. They cannot obtain truth, life, or love. We know that a desire for holiness is requisite to gaining it, but if we really desire this above all else, we shall lay down all for it. First, learn your willingness to do this, and then you may calculate safely on the only practical way of reaching holiness. Prayer cannot change the unalterable truth or give us the understanding of it, but a desire to know and do the will of God is necessary, and also a symptom that we are growing wiser. But this desire needs no expression from the lips or lives expressing. Asking God to heal the sick has no effect to gain the ear of love beyond its ever-presence. The only beneficial effect it has is mind acting on the body through a stronger faith to heal it. But this is one belief casting out another, a belief in God casting out a belief of sickness, and not the understanding of the principle that heals being. Jesus said, "A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand." A belief is not the science of being that heals the sick and casts out sickness on the ground that sensation and intelligence are not in matter. The truth of being is what destroys error. Exchanges of the same commodity are the mere merchandise of mind and not science. Deity interposes not in behalf of one and not another who adopts the same measures in prayer. If the sick recover on the platform of prayer, it is the result of individual belief. All may avail themselves of God and science as a present help in trouble. Love is impartial and universal in its adaptation and bestowments, the open fount that saith, Ho, every one that thirst, come ye and drink. Prayer to a person affects the sick as a drug that has no efficacy of its own, but borrows its power from faith and belief in matter. The drug does nothing in the case inasmuch as it has no intelligence. The principle of man and not a person produces all good. Seeking the science of life and not content with a material sense of things gives hungering and thirsting after righteousness, because it reveals the perfect principle on which life and immortality are upon. A wordy prayer may afford a sense of quiet and self-justification, but this makes the sinner a hypocrite. We never despair of an honest heart, but those spasmodically face to face with their wickedness and always seeking to hide it are the indexes that correspond not with contents, the counterfeit or true manhood that holds secret fellowship with their own sins. Such are spoken of in the scriptures as whited sepulchres full of uncleanness, making long prayers, etc. If the author of much apparent fervor and many prayers is sensual and insincere, what is the mental comment of these understanding the science of being? That Eddy had reached the standpoint of this prayer, this would not be the case. If our silent thoughts support the conclusion that we feel all the aspiration, humility, gratitude, and love they pour forth, this is enough to know of our Christian estate, and it is greatly wise not to deceive ourselves or others. Nothing is hidden that shall not be revealed. Professions and prayers, we regret to say, cover a multitude of sins. Christians rejoice at the secret beauty and bounty of their being, though hidden from the world, is known to God. Self-abnegation, purity of love are a constant prayer. It is the practice and understanding of our God being that gains the ears and right hand of omnipotence and calls down blessing infinite. Trustworthiness is the only foundation of faith. Without a fitness for holiness, we shall not receive it, nor yield faithful adherences to it. God is love. More than this we cannot ask. Higher we cannot look. Beyond this we may not go. To regard God a person that forgives or punishes sin according to his mercy is sought or unsought is to misunderstand love, and institute prayer as the safety valve for wrongdoing. Do we ask wisdom to be merciful to sin? Then we ask amiss to consume it on our lusts, and to forgive sin without punishment allows the sin to multiply, and this is neither mercy nor wisdom. A magistrate may remit a criminal sentence, but this is no benefit morally to the criminal, and has only saved him from one form of punishment. The moral law that alone is capable of justifying or condemning shall still demand man to go up higher or make the penalty of a broken law that punishes to compel this progress. Personal pardon of sin, and there is none other, for principle never pardons sin, leaves man free to commit anew the offense. If indeed he has not suffered sufficiently from sin to turn from it with loathing, truth entertains no pardon for error, but wipes it out in the most effectual manner. Asking God to pardon sin is a vain repetition such as heathens use. Habitual goodness is praying without ceasing, in which motives are made manifest by the blessing we bestow, whether these are or are not acknowledged, and attest our worthiness to be made partakers of love. We cannot pray aright and believe that God, who is the same yesterday and forever, is changeable or influenced in the least by a mortal sense of what man needs. He who is immutably right will do right, without being reminded of it, and the wisdom of man is insufficient to select from God. We would not stand before a blackboard and pray the principle of mathematics to work out a problem for man, nor should we ask the principle of all good to do a work already done, and which we have only to avail ourselves of, that is, to understand in order to receive its blessing. The principle of man must be reflected by man, else he is not the image and likeness of the patient, tender and true, yea, the one altogether lovely, and to go higher than this, and understand God is love, is the work of eternity. When thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut the door, pray to the Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. The closet signifies the sanctuary of spirit, its door opening on soul, and not sense, opening to truth, God, and closing on error. The Father in secret is the principle of man, unseen to personal sense. the infinite intelligence that knows all things and rewards according to motives, regarding mind only and not speech. The prayer of the righteous that heals the sick is after the manner our Master taught when he bade his students enter into the spirit of prayer. The door of personal sense closed, lips mute in man in audience with his Maker, where spirit instead of matter and soul instead of sense are understood the standpoint of being, even the principle thereof that destroys sickness, sin, and death. Thus the power of life, love, and truth will destroy sin, sickness, and death, and enlarge the capacities of man, revealing his God-given dominion over earth. But remember also that none but the pure in heart shall see God, shall be able to take this scientific position of prayer in which personal sense is silenced, and spirit the master of man. After a momentary cessation in the belief and dream of life and matter, whereby life, that is God, unfolds itself, comes the understanding and consciousness of dominion over the body that casts out air and heals the sick, and you speak as one having authority. We have taught our students the footsteps to this prayer. Let them answer today. Have they followed them? A great relinquishment of material things must precede this advanced spiritual understanding, isms but retarded, and mediumship more than most things. This prayer is not faith, it is demonstration. It heals the sick and advances man in a scale of being. It recognizes the falsity of personal sense and the life that is soul. Only as we rise above sensuality and sin can we reach its standpoint. Prayer addressed to a person prevents our letting go of personality for the impersonal spirit to whom all things are possible. We cannot serve two masters if we are sensibly with our body and consequently our words, and regarding omnipotence a person, whose ear we would gain. We are not soul, life, love, and truth, and therefore not in harmony of being in oneness with the Father, in demonstration of the Spirit and power. Make it a conscious reality for a single moment that life and intelligence are not in the body, and you are without sensation in the body, and if sick, will find yourself well. Sorrow is turned into joy. When we become conscious soul, able to govern the body with life, truth, and love, hence these words of the Master, I and the Father are one, that wrought such blessed works and greater works than I in the flesh ye can do, because I go to the Father. The scientific position of intelligence is soul triumphing over sense. Absent from the body and present with the life is not ecstasy or trance, but a realization of the science of life as laid down in this volume. It is obedient to the law of God, governing the body by spirit instead of matter. Therefore our Master said, after this manner pray ye. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is done in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors.
Okay, let's continue. Also, Mrs. Stetson lifted from Mrs. Eddy and her board the shadow of every fear which had plagued them. Mrs. Eddy breathed easily for the first time in months. Her board proceeded to finish trampling Augusta Stetson in the dust. On the very day that Mrs. Eddy had written her pilot script, Take Notice, she had written to Archibald McLeland, chairman of the board of directors, October 12, 1909. Beloved student, learn at once if the Mother Church can be prosecuted for suspending a student on even expelling them, who is giving us so much trouble as Mrs. Stetson does, and if it can be done safely, drop Mrs. Stetson's connection with the Mother Church. Let no one know that I have written you on this subject. Lovingly yours, Mary Baker Eddy. Mrs. Eddy had always trouble with relative pronouns in times of excitement. The board immediately proceeded to its welcome assignment. Mrs. Stetson's own trustees had presented a report entirely vindicating her. The congregation of Mrs. Stetson's church had been voted to accept this whitewashing report after a sensational all-day meeting in which riots occurred and policemen had to be posted at the church. For Mrs. Stetson had enough enemies in her own congregation to make the discussion of her status exciting. Virgil Stickler, the first reader of the church, had finally taken sides against her. He was the one who had supplied the Boston board with much of his evidence of the manner in which Mrs. Stetson had given its members death treatments, and he was the dominating leader of the minority position in the church. Strickler's diary concerning the conversation at some of the new practitioners' meetings provided an extraordinary commentary on the manner in which some of Mrs. Eddy's habits of thought affected her impressionable followers. For Mrs. Eddy, there were two different minds, the divine mind, which could not err, and the mortal mind, which was entirely error. How far astray this bit of dogma could lead impressionable souls, including Mrs. Eddy herself, is well illustrated in the following excerpt from Stickler's record of meeting Mrs. Stetson, held with the practitioners upon her return from her first hearing in Boston, the hearing that was dismissed. The date was July 31st, 1909. I said, Mrs. Stetson, if we tell this, they will expel you instantly from the mother church, she said. I know it. What shall we do? After a while, she said, we must deny that I ever said any of those things. I deny that I ever said them. I said, but Mrs. Stetson, you did say them, and you have habitually taken up people by the name and treated them. She replied that it was not her that took them up, that it was the human that said those things, and that the human was not her real self, and that she could say that she never said them and do it with a mental reservation that her real self had never said them. Miss Blank, one of the practitioners, then broke into say that she had denied in this way in a certain lawsuit, and that it was perfectly proper to deny something you had said if you only did it with the mental reservation that while the human self may have done the thing, it was the real self that was denying having done it. Pretty soon, Miss Blank, another practitioner, said that she had been on the witness stand for 2 days in the lawsuit mentioned and had testified throughout from the absolute, and the opposing lawyer had never caught her once. Not to be outdone, Mrs. Blank, another practitioner, spoke up and said that she had been on the witness stand for days and a day and a half in the same lawsuit and had done the same thing. This explanation of the way in which some of Mrs. Eddy's doctrines may be utilized to heal a suffering conscience offers a perfect demonstration of the morass in which the philosophy must fall when it provides those standards to distinction between subjective and objective truth. Once Mrs. Eddy had denied the reality of an objective material world, she stripped away all standards by which any truth could be ascertained. No human idea can ever have its truth demonstrated until it is tested and compared with the objective reality which existence. Mrs. Eddy utterly denied. Thus does Mrs. Eddy's philosophy lead inevitably into the traditional night where all cows are black, and that is where it led Mrs. Stetson after she had been vindicated by her own church. The Boston board summoned her for trial before its own members. Neither Mrs. Eddy nor her directors intended to leave Augustus Stetson a leg to stand on. Even though her recognition as a teacher and healer had been taken away, she might somehow manage to cause trouble if she were allowed to remain in the room in the mother church. So a new trial was called in Boston. Mrs. Stetson was charged with sins as various as undue control of her students, malpractice against other mother church members, and self-deification. At the end of the trial, she was excommunicated from the mother church forever. Mrs. Stetson to the end made no move of resistance of any sort. Excommunication from the mother church did not end her membership in the New York church, which she had founded, but as a mere member of a branch church, she had no standing in Christian Science. She immediately handed in her resignation to her own congregation and never again crossed the threshold of the temple which she had raised. Poor Mrs. Stetson. She never ceased to affirm that Mrs. Eddy was a modern Christ, and that her own excommunication was only one more step in the climb of Mrs. Eddy's Christ-like level, a level where one had shaken off all material bonds and become pure spirit. Die, she exclaimed once to a question. Why, of course I shan't die. I haven't an organ in my body, not as a one. I'm already on a plane that would mean instantaneous death to any one of you. Never once did she admit a belief that Mrs. Eddy had turned against her. Years later, when Mrs. Eddy's letters ordered her excommunication, if it can be done safely, was made public, Mrs. Stetson flatly denied the authenticity of the document. She was quoted as saying in an interview published in the New York World, Mrs. Eddy took no part in the unwarranted and arbitrary action of the board of directors in dropping my name from the roll of the material organization of the Christian Science Church in 1909. I invite Mrs. Ditmore and board of directors to produce any such letter or letters claiming to be from Mrs. Eddy, which they will submit to a handwriting expert for the examination of the signature. Mrs. Eddy never wrote such a letter. Can anyone imagine her doing anything in an underhand way? Augusta Stetson lived to a ripe old age in 1928 when she died of heart disease. After a physician had been called to relieve her intense suffering, she was still proclaiming that she would be immortal here and now. To the very end, she maintained that Mrs. Eddy came to her constantly and that they communed together every night on planes too high for human ken. I feel a little bad for Mrs. Stetson, to be honest with you. A little heartbroken. Mrs. Stetson was formally excommunicated from the Mother Church on November 18, 1909. She resigned from the New York branch church that she herself had created on November 22nd, and with the next few months, the danger of her own presence removed, the Boston board had excommunicated all of the Stetson trustees and practitioners. Even officials and leaders in her church who had raised a voice in her defense was thrust in outer darkness. Her memory was torn out root and branch from the church, and she had builded, and the fields in which it had flourished were sown with salt. The eager interest with which Mrs. Eddy watched the course of these proceedings is attested by the words ascribed by one of Mrs. Stetson's students, Mrs. Mary P. Pinley, to the first reader of the Mother Church, when after Mrs. Stetson excommunicated, the first reader came to admonish Mrs. Pinney in accordance with The eager interest with which Mrs. Eddy watched the course of these proceedings is attested by the word ascribed by one of Stetson's students, Miss Mary R. Piney, to the first reader of the Mother Church, when after Mrs. Stetson excommunicated, the first reader came to admonish Mrs. Pinney in accordance with a bylaw of the manual. She disputed the right of the board of directors to impose on her their interpretation of Mrs. Eddy's teachings. Then, to quote Miss Pinney, Judge Smith made a statement to the effect that Mrs. Eddy had never expressed so much active interest in any issue since the Woodbury trial. I quote the manual, Article 22, Section 7, that Mrs. Eddy is not to be consulted in case of discipline. Judge Smith replied, Mrs. Eddy has made an exception in this case. To the end, however, Mrs. Eddy maintained her fiction of being entirely interested in and aloof from the conflict. Her last letter to Mrs. Stetson, the final of their years of warm and devoted correspondence, had written on August 30th, 1909. With cool unction, Mrs. Eddy repeated the assurance of her love and voiced her trust that God would direct Augusta's footsteps in the path of his flock. She urged her to follow the guidance of the Holy Bible, Science and Health, and the Mother Church Manual, and concluded, I have not the time to think of the students and all their varied duties of life, but I have the faith to leave them in the hands of God, who giveth all men liberally and upbraided none. As ever yours in Christ, Mary Baker Eddy. What Mrs. Eddy really meant was that she was leaving Augusta in the hands of the board of directors. Mrs. Stetson never heard from Mrs. Eddy again. Mrs. Eddy did, however, address a few words to New York congregation in November after Mrs. Stetson had been forever exiled. She said in a letter published in the Sentinel, Beloved brethren, in consideration of the present momentous question as issued in First Church of Christ Scientists, New York City, I am constrained to say, if I can settle this church difficulty amicably by a few words, as many students think I can, I herewith cheerfully subscribe to these words of love. My beloved brethren in First Church of Christ Scientists, New York City, I advise you with all my soul to support the directors of the Mother Church and unite with those in your church who are supporting the Mother Church director. It was not this appeal, however, which saved to Mrs. Eddy the largest branch church in her organization. Only the fact that Mrs. Stetson bowed her head for the executioner's blow without a protest allowed Mrs. Eddy to die with her church intact instead of sundered by revolution. In her last year, Mrs. Eddy's physical condition was particularly distressing to her board, which had only now come to know that she was a prey to very human ills, which in no way became a priestess whose powers of healing had been heralded to the ends of the winds. During the days with her alternate courage and vacillations, she was directing the destruction of Augusta. She was still subject to the same illness of hysterical nature which had been with her all her life, and there was never assurance that one day which found her active and able to direct her affairs with dynamic energy would not be followed by another in which she might be entirely helpless. Okay. Science and Health.
And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and power and the glory forever. The following is the spiritual significance of the Lord's Prayer. Harmonious and eternal principle of man. Nameless and adorable intelligence. Spiritualize man. Control the discords of matter with the harmony of spirit. Give us the understanding of God, and truth will destroy sickness, sin, and death, as it destroys the belief of intelligent matter. And lead man into soul, and deliver him from personal sense, for God is truth, life, and love forever. Atonement is oneness with God. It is life, truth, and love fulfilled, whereby sickness, sin, and death are destroyed. Jesus of Nazareth explained and demonstrated his oneness with the Father, for which we owe him endless love and homage. Although at the time of his labors he received less gratitude and honor than any other man, his mission was both individual and collective. He did life's work right in justice to himself and to show us how to do ours, but not to do it for us or to relieve us of a single responsibility in the case. He taught us the way of life, its principle and proof, demonstrating what he taught, that we might understand its principle, how it healed the sick, cast out error, and triumphed over death. Jesus was more the idea of God than a man can be whose origin is less spiritual than his. Therefore, he demonstrated higher than others the principle of being. Even his oneness with God, he understood the science of those saying of his, I am the truth and the life. I and the Father are one. Any reference to himself was made to Christ, the principle of the man Jesus, for he called not intelligent man, but God. It was not to a person, but the truth, life, and love he looked to destroy sickness, sin, and death. The mission of Jesus was to demonstrate the science of life. He was its idea, even the chosen of principle to prove God and what God does for man. Belief had established the false conclusion that man was in matter, that truth and life were in man, and man was mortal, sinning, sick, and dying. He wished to show this belief was the very opposite of truth, and that spirit was not in matter. Hence the death on the cross and the reappearance of Jesus according to a scientific statement of life, namely, though you destroy this temple or body, yet will I, spirit, build it again. I, the life, substance, and intelligence of the universe and man, am not in matter that you can destroy. His beautiful metaphors and parables of the tree and its fruit, the fountain and the stream, the tares and the wheat, the sower and the husbandman, explained intelligence and life not mingled with sin and death. He laid the axe of science at the root of the tree of knowledge to cut down all that embraced opposite doctrines, hence error's hatred of him and truth's approval. This more pure and spiritual idea named Jesus destroyed the beliefs of life and matter and gave to man the understanding of the principle of being. Those students who followed his instructions and example loved and honored him, and those who did not hated and dishonored him. The former cast out error and healed the sick with Christ, truth, the latter only in the name of truth. Of the 70 he taught, but 11 remained faithful, showing how far the science he taught and demonstrated was apart from the acceptance of the world of sense. And when Christ, truth, cometh again, will he find faith on earth? Over 18 centuries ago, he came to his own, and his own received him not. Those professing Christ are sometimes the first to reject truth, if it collides with their beliefs. Even its severest persecutors have been of this class. The honest fishermen, who bid little to leave, were those who left all for Christ. Truth, until progress compelled the change, and the learned Paul stepped forth for truth. When a teacher of music demonstrates by some masterly performance the harmony of music, he gives the proof of a principle that the learner must understand. But if this demonstration included also a nameless sacrifice, we should admit the principle of it was not only harmony but love. This was the precious import of our master's teaching and demonstration. He proved the science of being not only by destroying sickness, sin, and death, but the significance of life without death, and in this proof was embraced big love. Error had hoped to destroy truth and kill Jesus, those for whom he laid down all worldly honors and bore their infirmities, what through his stripes they may be healed, were his accusers. So will it be today. Christian martyr, he who best understands the truth of being, will be most falsified, pursued, and condemned. The teacher of music, who demonstrates for the benefit of others, has by no means relieved them from giving the proof requisite to show where they stand in silence. He rather does this for their example, that they may understand that which they should demonstrate. Implicit faith in the teacher, whose self-abnegation and toil have bestowed blessings on man, will never make musicians of the learners. They must go and do likewise, or they are not improving their talents, which unimproved condemn them. We must understand the principle Jesus taught at whatever expense and practice it, or we are not Christians. The science of life that our Master demonstrated was not a theory, doctrine, or belief. It revealed a principle that brought its proof with it. And this proof was not forms or systems of religion, but the science of being that brought out all the sweet harmonies of life. Jesus informed John what the proof of Christ's coming was, saying, "Go and tell him the things ye see and hear, how the sick are healed, the lame walk, the deaf hear, the blind see, and to the poor the gospel is preached." Tell him what its demonstration is, and the spiritual John will at once perceive God. It is principle. Materia Medica professed the ability to heal also, and the Pharisees to teach Christ, truth. But they only hindered the success of Jesus' mission. Many of the 70 he had taught stood in his way also, together with one who boldly betrayed him into the hands of his enemies. If our Master had never had a student, he would not have come to the death on the cross. But his mission would have been unfulfilled, and his history lacked its sweet pathos. Through this unmerited persecution, we see the fate of science in a world of error, and the reception a sensuous world gives the principle that contradicts personal sense with soul. At the same time that I love Jesus more than all men of the past or present age, treading alone a path of thorns up to the throne of wisdom, in speechless agony exploring the way for others, yet I cannot see that he has spared us one individual experience, or that we have not the cup to drink in proportion to our fitness to drink it and demonstrate God above others. To keep the commandment of our Master and follow his example is our proper return, and only evidence of gratitude for all he has done for us. But this is not a personal worship, no reward to a person. It is to understand the principle Jesus taught and proved and follow as much as in us lies, his example, to separate ourselves from the world of error and press forward to the life that is truth and love. The pleasures, frowns, or flatteries of earth are but ghosts of nothingness compared to the prize set before us. And laying aside every weight and sin that is so easily beset to us, let us press forward to the high calling of God in Christ, putting aside personal self and sense for soul, the principle of being. Every pang of repentance, every suffering for sin, accompanied with reformatory efforts, and every good deed, stones for sin. But if the sinner is sorry and continues to pray and to sin and be sorry, he hath no part in the atonement. To understand God, whom to know aright is life eternal, is to do the will of wisdom, and none hath part in him who demonstrates not in part the principle embraced in the teaching and practice of our Master. If not obeying the science of being according to its principle, God, we have should no confidence in man's safety, because God is good and man repents. But if we are growing spiritual and error is yielding to truth in our demonstration of being and our daily walk and conversation, we shall say at length, I have fought the good fight and kept the faith, for I am a better man. This is having part in the atonement. If a man stands still, praying and expecting because of another man's goodness, suffering, and triumph, he will reach his harmony and reward. That man will vibrate, a pendulum between sin and the hope of forgiveness, selfishness and sensuality, winding him up into his action, and his growth will be slow. An atonement with love and truth is to apply the meaning of the life and not death of Jesus to deeds in a Christian character, and not to cover or forgive sin, but to destroy it in the most effectual manner. When truth lays the axe at the root of error, saying, cut it down, then comes the experience and suffering that causes one, even as a drowning man, to make vigorous efforts to save himself, and these efforts are what save him. Work out your own salvation is a demand of life and love, and to this end God worketh with you. Occupy until I come, that is, wait for the reward, and grow not weary in well-doing. Although your endeavors are against fearful odds, receiving no present reward, go not back to error, nor become a sluggard in the contest, and you will find your reward when the smoke of battle clears away, so that you discern the good you have done, and you are gained from experience. Love often delays to deliver from temptation, that it may try and prove you by fire. If you understand the science of being sufficiently to have faith in the right, and no faith in wrong, you will work more earnestly, though more silently perhaps in persecution and amid applause, when your labor is more needed, and the reward of your self-sacrifice is great, though it be never be here. Final deliverance from error, whereby we rejoice in immortality, boundless freedom, and sinless sense, is not won through smooth footsteps, nor through doctrines or pinning one's faith to personality. Whoso believeth wrath is righteous, or appeased by the unmerited death of a good man, cannot understand God. Justice requires no propitiation but from the sinner. Mercy cancels without pay or sacrifice, and revenge is inadmissible in love. The wrath that is appeased is not destroyed, but indulged, and may require another sacrifice, one being found insufficient. But these are the traits of heathen deities, and not of our God, the principle that is love. God's wrath vented on his only Son is without logic or humanity, but a man-made belief. The beautiful import of this hard place in theology is that suffering is an error of personal sense that truth destroys, and sin falls, a broken reed, at the feet of love. The rabbinical teaching said, "He that taketh one dark doctrine firm in faith has the Holy Ghost dwelling in him." But this receives a strong rebuke from our Master, who said, "Faith without works is dead." Faith, as a belief, is not a pendulum between nothing and something, holding on to no foundation, but the advanced understanding that is sometimes misnamed faith, is the evidence gained from spiritual sense that rebukes the belief of personal sense, and brings out the experiences, the life that is God. In Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and English, the word faith embraces two meanings, vis-a-vis truthfulness and trustworthiness. The first trusts all to another, and the second understands and relies on oneself. "Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief," expresses the helplessness of a blind faith, whereas "believe and you shall be saved" is self-reliant, trustworthy faith that implies the understanding that brings its own reward. The Hebrew gives the following signification of the verb to believe: to be firm, lasting, constant, and this certainly applies to truth understood, for firmness in error will never save man from sickness, sin, or death. An acquaintance with the original text, together with a willingness to give up beliefs founded on dynasties and the want passions of men, for the advanced views of civilization and the spiritual sense of truth, makes the Scripture a chart of life to man. Christ and God are words synonymous. Christ signifies the soul and principle of the man, Jesus. The manner of expressing him in the Scripture gives the meaning of this relationship vis-a-vis Jesus, the Son of God, that is, the idea of principle and the offspring of soul and not sense. Publius Lentulus wrote to the conscript fathers at Rome, "The disciples of Jesus believe in the Son of God. Those who were taught by him the science of being reach the glorious perception that God is the only author of man. The Virgin Mother first conceived this idea of God and named it Jesus. The illumination of spiritual sense had put to silence personal sense with Mary, thus mastering material law and establishing through demonstration that God is the Father of man. The science of being overshadowed the pure sense of the Virgin Mother with a full recognition that spirit is the basis of being. The idea we call substance, and Mary, named Jesus, dwelt forever in the bosom of the Father, in the principle of man, and woman perceived it because of her more spiritual nature. The belief that life originates with the sexes is strongest in the most material natures, whereas the understanding of the spiritual origin of man cometh not only of the pure in heart. Man and woman, as ideas of God, that is, spirit, meet soul's expectancy and are immortal evidence that spirit is harmonious and man eternal. Jesus was the offspring of Mary's self-conscious God being in creative wisdom. Hence he was more spiritual, more the idea of God, and demonstrated the science of life, as others cannot whose origin is material. This idea of truth came to rebuke rabbinical error, to point out the way of truth and life, and to demonstrate, as it did, throughout the whole earthly career of Jesus, the difference between the offspring of soul and of sense, of truth and error. Christ was God, therefore the principle of the man, Jesus, otherwise his Father. Jesus acknowledged no ties of flesh, saying, "Call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven." Again, who is my mother, and who are my brethren, but they that do the whim of my Father? We have no record of his ever calling a man father. He recognized God, the only principle of being, therefore the Father of all. Referring to the materiality of the age, he said, "The time cometh, and now is that they who worship the Father shall worship him in spirit and in truth." Again, foreseeing the persecution that must attend the introduction of the science, he said, "The time cometh, that whosoever killeth you will think he doeth God service."
Okay, let's finish the reading and then okay. She left her house, or indeed the 3 rooms in which she dwelt on the 2nd floor, except for her drives, and even with her iron determination and an elevator which carried her directly to her carriage, she could not always find the strength for this habitual appearance. These periods of confinement accounted for her renewal of the rumors concerning her death and the fraud being practiced on the public by her directors, the rumors which found such credence, and then that even Augustus Stetson herself had been deceived. Many others of less eminent positions were also misled, and the directors were constantly faced with the necessity of combating the most unfortunate reports which refused to be down despite the warmest denials. One particularly embarrassing incident was involved in Brooklyn in Dyker Heights was a flourishing Christian that science was in Brooklyn on Dyker Heights was a flourishing Christian Science church which had been built and fostered by a Miss Delta Gilbert. Miss Gilbert was a tall, blue-eyed woman of highly emotional temperament who had never known Mrs. Eddy personally but had established quite a following in the Brooklyn residential districts. In May of 1909, shortly after Mrs. Stetson sent to Mrs. Eddy the fatal composite letter, Mrs. Gilbert decided, as had many others, that Mrs. Eddy was either dead or mindless, and that she was surviving only as a corporation. Having reached this conclusion, Miss Gilbert bought a ticket for Boston with the determination to verify her opinion. She went out up to the great house of Chestnut Hill quite unannounced, rang the bell, and was received by Mr. Dickey. She was informed that she could not see Mrs. Eddy. She sat for some minutes with Mr. Dickey and the great silent reception room, heard not even a sound in all the vast mansion, and decided that she now knew all. Mrs. Eddy was no more. When she left Mr. Dickey, she went back to the Parker house where she was staying and wrote an ultimatum. Under the date of May 21st, 1909, she said in a letter subsequently published in the New York World, My dear Dr. Mr. Dickey, I came to Boston to see the leader and go into the home of Mrs. Eddy. I did both. You, of course, working metaphysically, well know what it means to enter a house and get the mental atmosphere that fills it. I accomplished all I wanted in that visit. I saw the only leader when I saw you. The only leader that you or anyone else in the house can produce in the flesh. For a long while, I have been maturing my plans. I have backed of me money, power, and influence from a worldly standpoint, and God from a spiritual. It is not my purpose to attempt to overthrow the Christian Science organization, as I believe it was originally stated right by Mr. Eddy, the author of the inspired textbook Science and Health. The book will stand. What I purpose to do with God back of me is to down this personally conducted tour of religion, this fetishism. The idol must go. God is our leader, is my leader, and with him to guide and govern me, I shall commence my work to tear down this idol. I shall organize a church of Christian Science Church in New York City. Hold on one second. There is much more. Mr. Gilbert gave the church authority 3 days to make a reply. There was much more. Miss Gilbert gave the church authorities 3 days to make a reply before she put her plans into effect. On the final day of grace, she was visited by 2 high officials of the church organization. There was a long and anguished meeting. The spokesman talked to her with tears in his eyes. He and his fellow officials were indeed in a most unfortunate situation. They could not publicly produce Mrs. Eddy because of her physical condition. On the other hand, they could not proceed as if she were really dead, for the simple reason that she was liable to rise up in any day, very much alive and with completely renewed energy, to overturn all that her officials had tried to accomplished during her indisposition. As Mrs. Gilbert later wrote in a published statement, to see and talk with the hidden leader was all I asked. It was then that he wept. I had asked the one impossible thing. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Mrs. Gilbert finally capitulated. She agreed not to seek to found a rival church. She later stated that one of her visitors urged on her possibly to bring about the purification of the church by other means than exposure. She further quoted him as saying, "If you have made any financial sacrifice in this work, divine love will make up all the losses. Only abandon your plan." Mrs. Gilbert agreed graciously after hands had been shaken all around. The visitors departed, and she sat down and penned another letter. She stated that her expense in her undertaking had amounted to some $5,000. If divine love will send, give, or loan to me some $5,000, she wrote, the money would tide me over for the next few months and enable me to start my church work in the fall in New York, if at that time you think it advisable. This finished, Mrs. Gilbert and the board of directors sent her letter to the newspaper and immediately dropped the Gilbert name from the roll of the mother church. But the condition in the Eddy household, which made it possible for situations such as the Gilbert incident to arise, undoubtedly plagued Mrs. Eddy's harassment directors to an extreme degree. After they consummated what they called their house cleaning in Mrs. Stetson's church, they got the next friend's suit settled so that all days of a contest might be relative. Even Mr. Eddy's will was eliminated. Their life with Mrs. Eddy's will was eliminated. Their life was hardly easier, for Mrs. Eddy refused to die. She lived on and on and on, querulous, commanding, ailing, suspicious. Even in the smallest matter, she could keep her directors in hot water constantly. A statue, for instance, had been ordered for placing in the new addition to the mother church. The commission was given to the sculptor after Mrs. Eddy had been consulted regarding the design, the figure of a kneeling woman when the church was completed. The directors asking Mrs. Eddy's permission to place the sculpture above the great organ. Mrs. Eddy refused flatly, then announced that she did not want the thing in the church at all. When the directors pointed out that the commission for carving it had been placed with her expense permission and that they were under obligation to receive it, she was no less adamant. She announced that she had changed her mind. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. So change her mind constantly with no she changed her mind constantly with no reference whatever to anything that had gone before. When this habit drove her directors almost frantic, she would lean back with a benevolent smile to declare that God was speaking through her and nothing more was to be said. Is a leader any less a leader because she changes her mind? She would inquire with finality. I do change my mind frequently, but when I do, it's God that changes me. He has given me additional light. Thereupon, Mrs. Eddy would say impressively that in over 40 years of leadership, she had never made a mistake. She kept her secretaries in a constant dance by the same sort of tactics. She would dictate a letter, have it all typed out, and then revise it time again until it had gone through so many drafts that the original version was unrecognizable. Sometimes she would ponder over a letter for hours, seeking for what she said was the right word. In this way, she still toyed with science and health even in these final days, spending long hours when she felt in the mood in rereading her work and revising it with notes between the lines as had been custom for years. Hold on. I'm texting. Hold on. Hold on. Some of these changes were made at the suggestion of correspondents. One worshiper wrote into the point that the cicatrized joints should correctly be made to read ankylosed joints. Mrs. Eddy consulted her 3 dictionaries, which she kept always beside her, and agreed, but she would not always yield so graciously. When one correspondent wrote that hecatombs of gushing theories was a phrase that did not mean anything, since a hecatomb was a sacrifice of 100 bulls, Mrs. Eddy refused to amend the line in Science and Health. The phrase sounded well, and she was satisfied. She told her secretary that since the statement was used in a sense of ridicule, it is quite fully expressed what she wanted to say. People do not always understand my sense of humor, she explained. Occasionally, some of Mrs. Eddy's correspondents were not wholly differential in their suggestion by revising her use of the English tongue. One woman, having read in miscellaneous writings Mrs. Eddy's denunciation of critics as indulged Shirley censors, wrote for England to suggest that Christian Science should not use epithets. Had the lady only known Mrs. Eddy's resources and epithets, she would have realized that the critic was getting off lightly. But this letter displeased Mrs. Eddy extremely. Between her periods of literary activities, the old lady would always find time to rearrange the furnishings of the 3 rooms in which she spent practically all her working and sleeping hours. When she moved into the great house at Chestnut Hill, she decided that she did not like the rooms that had been prepared for her. They were too large. Her study was 20 feet long, her desk being placed at the far end in the bay window. When she sat at her desk, it took all of several seconds for a secretary to reach her side after he had opened the door. She declared that something must be done to save her time. Her bed was likewise so graciously commodious that she felt as if she were voyaging across sea of carpet. She announced that the entire scale of her living quarters must be cut down. Long consultations ensued. Finally, an architect was called from the West. No local residents were ever given a chance to see the Eddy establishment at close range. Hold on. As a result of the architect deliberations, it was decided that the entire scale of Mrs. Eddy's living quarters should be telescoped, and Mrs. Eddy retired to the 3rd floor of the mansion for 3 weeks while the necessary alterations were being accomplished. Part of the extra space obtained in this manner was utilized for the new elevator to carry Mrs. Eddy direct to her porte cochere. Hold on. Mrs. Eddy came back to her revised quarters. She spent long hours in rearranging their furnishings. She would take infinite time to decide about the positions to be according the furniture and ornaments, the bibelots, and all other accoutrements with which she was surrounded. Miss Dickey Mr. Dickey, her secretary, won her heart immediately by an invention for trying out pictures in different positions before they were hung. The invention consisted merely of a stick with a hook on the end. With the aid of this device, a picture could be held up in a countless number of positions, while Mrs. Eddy sat back and looked with appraising eyes, trying to be possible location until she had hit on the right one. Mr. Dickey was also a great convenience in assigning her to adjust her extensive collections of souvenirs, samples from the extensive accumulation of offerings at her shrine over a long period of time. A simple and enraptured soul, if there was one, he took an exquisite delight in cooperation with the old lady to satisfy her whims. She herself wrote Mr. Dickey in ecstatic phases, named the spot on the mantle where her ornament should rest, while I, overjoyed at the rare privilege, moved things back and forth at her command until everything was placed as she desired it. Once Mrs. Eddy had decided on a location, she never forgot it. Her rooms were dusted and swept whenever she went on her drive, and anything was half an inch out of position when she returned, woe to the housemaid. If they insisted that anything had been returned exactly to its former position, an argument ensued which was very painful for all concerned. One gathers from Mr. Dickey's accounts that Mrs. Eddy was still a master hand in using the epithets by which the English lady had been obtained. Mr. Dickey solved the serious problem very simply. Just as all great inventions are simple, he suggested the use of tacks to mark the exact location of everything in the room. Then when things were moved, they were sent but back exactly on the tracks. There could be no possible mistake. This happy result of the ingenuity so pleased Mr. Eddy, Mrs. Eddy, that she was in good humor for days. Mr. Dickey assumed the status of a genius. Almost her last official act before she died was to appoint him to her board of directors. Between her periods of energetic puttering, Mrs. Eddy would time and again succumb to the physical sufferings that the household always knew as malicious animal magnetism. At such time, everyone in the menage was on emergency duty, just as happens in an army camp when the planes of the enemy are sighted. Miss Eddy's household consisted of from 12 to 18 persons beside herself, and the various in number being accounted for the number of mental healers who were in service around her. Her personal servants consisted of a housekeeper, a houseman, a coachman, a night watchman, and two maids, one of whom prepared her meals while the other cared for her room, her wardrobe, and her person. Okay, let's listen to Science and Health.
And these things will they do unto you because they have not known the Father or me. In other words, are ignorant of the principle of being, their Father on earth and in heaven being personality instead of principle, ignorant also of the origin of man, his nature and true existence. The world of air is blind to the truth of man, in the world of sense, to life that is soul. Jesus was neither understood in his origin, his nature, or works. Not one component part of his being did the world of sense get right. Even his righteousness and purity hindered not the accusation, he is Beelzebub, the chief of sinners, a glutton, and the friend of the impure. Christian martyr of the 19th century does it wrong thee only one half as much. Then remember it is enough for thee that the servant should be as his Lord, and that you be found worthy to unloose the sandals of thy master's faith. To conclude, persecution for righteousness' sake belongs to the past, and that Christianity today is at peace with the world, honored by sex and society, is to mistake its very nature. History will repeat itself, the trials of prophet, disciple, and apostle, those of whom the earth was not worthy, await in some form the pioneers of truth. Scripture informs us Jesus read the thoughts of man, discovering the hidden springs of action and construing them according to motive. Perceiving their thoughts as he walked with the students, he answered, unasked, questions that needed explanation. This mind reading was not clairvoyance. It was absence from the body, a spiritual insight wherewith he shewed the woman of Samaria her error, and convinced her of his superiority over man, and she went away saying, Is not this the Christ, the truth of man that discerns the error? His marvelous works are readily accounted for when we remember Christ as God, and that Jesus held all that he was, God, and wrought from the standpoint of his God being, and this was the science of being. A magistrate who lived at the time of Jesus wrote, "His rebuke is fearful," and his strong language in Scripture regarding hypocrisy confirms his saying. But the stronger evidence that his reproof was pointed and pungent is a necessity that there was when he cast out devils and healed the sick. The only civility truth exchanges with error is, "Get behind me, Satan." There is too much animal courage and not sufficient moral courage in society. Christians take up arms against error at home and abroad, grapple with sin in themselves and others, and continue this warfare until they have finished their course and thenceforth receive its reward. If you have triumphed sufficiently over the errors of personal sense for soul to hold the balance of power in your being, you will loathe sin and rebuke it, under whatever mask it appears, and you can bless your enemies only in this way. But they may not so construe it. We cannot choose but work out our own salvation on the principle Jesus taught and demonstrated, vis-a-vis casting out devils, healing the sick, and preaching the gospel of the poor. A moral coward is unfit to bear the standard of truth, and God will never place it in his hands. A member of the Methodist Church once said to us, "I hope when you write your work on science, you will dwell much on the atonement." After reading these pages, if the arm of the Lord is revealed to that mind anew, she will commence her own work, and with the unction of primitive Christianity, heal herself and others, and thus gain the liberty of the sons of God. This is regeneration, and to have part in the atonement, and to understand wherefore Jesus suffered and triumphed. But truth, lifting its voice above ology and isms, and requiring the reconstruction of man, must be persecuted, and those not having touched its garment and felt in their body to heal them will persecute it. If all those partaking of the sacrament intended to commemorate the suffering of Jesus had drank his cup, they would have revolutionized the world. Or if all who partake of these symbols today were Christians, taking up their cross, healing the sick, casting out error, and preaching Christ, truth to the poor, it would establish the millennium. But all who eat bread and drink wine in memory of Christ are not ready or willing to drink his cup and to leave all for Christ, the truth and life that is God. Then wherefore ascribe to this willingness with a dead right, before showing forth in your body that the truth has come to your understanding, that heals the sick and makes the body holy and acceptable, that Paul said was our only reasonable service. And if Christ, truth, has come to us in demonstration, no commemoration is requisite, for it is God with us. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it, and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink ye all of it." The glorious sense or proof of that hour is lost spiritually when confined to a literal sense or the use of bread and wine. The disciples were eating when he prayed and gave them bread. Now this would have been improper in a literal sense, but in its spiritual, it was natural and beautiful. Jesus prayed, was absent from the body and present with the Lord, his followers silent, humble, patient, self-sacrificing, and strong, anticipating the approaching hour of their master's betrayal, sat eating the manna that before had fed the persecuted followers of truth in the wilderness. Their bread came down from heaven. It was the great truth of spiritualized being that often had healed the sick and cast out error their master had broken, explained it to them before, and now was feeding and sustaining them. They also had borne it from house to house, breaking, explaining it to others, and now it comforted them. For this truth their master was about to suffer violence, and his cup of sorrow he must leave to them. He had drank it even with thanks. After a momentary weakness had said, "Let this cup pass from me." And now remembering also the cross and crown it bore, he said to his followers, "Drink ye all of it. Professors of Christ, are you drinking this cup? Has the blood of the New Testament, the suffering and persecution that attend a new understanding of God, been shared by you? Have you drank this cup? If not, have you commemorated Jesus in his cup?" When the human struggled with the divine, our great exemplar said, "Not my will, but thine be done." Not personal sense, but soul be represented by me. This new understanding of the love that is impersonal gives up all for Christ. Truth blesses them that curse it, heals the sick, casts out error, raises their dead in belief, and preaches to the poor. The rabbi and priest taught a material law, and it was an eye for an eye. and whose sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Not so did Jesus, the New Testamenter of God, copy his will. His law was love, and greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for a friend. But he did this for his enemies, showing the love, the life and truth that is the atonement with God. First on the list of Christian duties, he taught his followers to heal the sick. He attached no importance to dead ceremonies. It was the living Christ, the truth that is life, that made him the resurrection and life to all who follow him. Thus, keeping his precious precepts and following his demonstration in its understanding, we shall indeed drink his cup and be baptized with his purity, until we sit down with him anew in a fuller understanding of the principle of that man Jesus. For as often as ye eat his bread and drink his cup, ye do show forth the Lord's death till he come. A belief can never show forth the works of understanding, and has never yet followed Jesus to his demonstration. To do this, we must consecrate our lives to the principle for which he was crucified, and be willing to drink of the cup it brings. But for this cause, many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. Rites fetter the pinions of soul. They materialize and prevent the spirit by holding us to the body, for matter separates from spirit. We speak of the atonement of Christ, reconciling God to man, but Christ is God, and God propitiates not himself, and there is nothing higher to conciliate. Again, love and truth are not irreconcilable to the idea of God, and man is this idea. But man, being the shadow of Almighty, cannot exceed him in love or reconcile truth to error. His students understand the suffering, teaching, and demonstration of their glorious Master better than all this. When Jesus gave up the body material to be slain, and afterwards presented it to his students unchanged, he had proved what he had taught, showing them he was not dead, and they knew it was proof of the principle he had before taught, and disproved our opinions of a future resurrection, or a spiritual body at the change, called death. His body was a belief of matter, as before, until he rose to spirit above the reach of personal sense, and triumphed over the last enemy, death, as before he had conquered sickness and sin. And this what his followers were to commemorate in their lives, so far as they understood his teaching and demonstration, hence the saying, "The works that I do, ye shall do, and greater." Theology explains the crucifixion of Jesus, a pardon ready for all sinners. Spiritualism finds his death necessary only for the presentation after death of the personal Jesus, calling this a spirit's return. We differ from both, and while we respect all that is good in the church and outside of it, our later consecration to Christ has been on the ground of demonstration and not profession, yea, to follow the commands he gave to those he sent forth. For conscience sake, we dare not cling to the old belief, inasmuch as understanding somewhat the principle of his proof, the life and not death, that Jesus showed forth, raised us from hopeless disease, and gave us a triumph over sickness and sin, we never had gained from our former beliefs and profession of religion. The efficacy of the crucifixion of Jesus is the practical truth it demonstrated for our understanding, and the ultimately will deliver mankind from sickness, sin, and death. This truth he had before spoken in their midst, but until they saw it triumph over the grave, the disciples were not able to admit and demonstrate so fully its principle. Thomas, beholding the idea of it in Jesus after his supposed death, was forced to acknowledge how entire was the proof. From all the disciples had seen and suffered, they became more spiritual, therefore could better understand what the Master had taught them. This, therefore, was the resurrection, for it raised them from the blindness of a belief in God to the understanding of him, whom to know aright was life. They needed this, for soon their dear Master that had just risen to their comprehension would rise again. Higher in the spiritual scale of being, and so much beyond them in reward for all their faithfulness, he would disappear to their more material thoughts, and biblical history would name it the ascension. Ancient prophets who wrought before Jesus foretold his coming, and the reception the world of sense would give truth. Also, there is a connection inseparable between their experiences and those of every Christian who perceives the idea and accepts the understanding of God. Jesus, born of Virgin Mother, was more a miracle to that age than to this, for even the naturalist is now furnishing reports of embryology in some species wholly without the male element. The Bethlehem babe was the nearest approximation since the record in Genesis to the science of being, in which spirit makes man, for man born of woman was the usual advent of mortal man. And this material belief was what entered Mary's spiritual conception of Jesus, which accounts for the struggles of Gethsemane, but it made him the mediator between God and mortal man. This lack of entire science in the advent of Jesus produced its discord and met its fate in death. Had his origin and birth, however, been wholly apart from mortal belief, Jesus would not have been recognized by mortal man. And he was the light that was to lighten every man that cometh into the world. Therefore he must be the mediator or interpreter of truth to error that destroyed error and rebuked personal sense with the principle of being. Jesus never ransomed man by paying the debt sin incurs. Whosoever sin must suffer. This Christian martyr suffered for the truth that destroyed error, and while it blessed the whole world, was that for which it hated him. Even the sinner must learn truth by the things he suffers. Love is no compromise with sin and pays no debt of its contracting, but it can and does point out the way to escape from it and reach the harmony and science of being. The blood of that righteous man shed by sinners was a crime that affords no ground for further sin or a belief of its pardon. It was an injustice to humanity that the beat man should be sacrificed by the worse man. Jesus taught the way of escape from sin, but that all that sinneth shall die. In other words, that sin must be destroyed. Wisdom punishes instead of pardons sin. The terrible effect of our false views regarding the atonement is to make a sinner less fearful to sin. Believing a tear or prayer will secure its pardon, this heightens hypocrisy and suffocates conscience. The time is not far distant when our theological views of atonement will undergo as radical a change as those who have already been done regarding a bottomless pit burning with fire and brimstone, and the election and foreordination of a portion to be saved or to be lost. But for these false views regarding the forgiveness of sin, ministers and laymen would never break the commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," and then talk of their love for God and Christian experience. The sweet and spiritual significance of the death on the cross is love laying down all of earth to instruct its enemies the way to heaven, proving what heaven is and how obtained. We speak of the blood of Jesus as efficacious to save sinners. It is the efficacy of the truth and love that Jesus taught and demonstrated, which alone can destroy sin, and sinners are never saved. The blood of Christ was an offering of spirit and not matter, a pledge of undying love. O highest conception of spiritual sense, tell us, what is love? End of chapter.
Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.